Before we delve into this story, I want to ask a quick question. Where are you watching from right now? Write the name of your city or country in the comments. I love to know how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy true mysteries, cursed places, and stories that send chills down your spine until the very last second, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any of the new dark investigations we're about to unveil. Door by door. The iron gate creaked with the weight of years as Daniel Harper pushed it open. The sound echoed through the abandoned garden like a metallic lament. Before him, the Winchester mansion stood, irregular and impossible, as if built by someone who never slept or was never at peace. Windows at odd angles reflected the cloudy California sky. Stairs emerged from behind glass panes, leading nowhere. Exterior doors opened onto solid walls. It was an architecture that seemed to dream, or delirious. Daniel adjusted the strap of his backpack on his back. He was 32 years old, with a degree in structural engineering and a resume of historical restoration projects. Rational, precise, methodical. Nothing in his life allowed for the inexplicable. He had been hired by a private foundation that intended to transform the property into an architectural research center. His job, to assess the structural stability of the house and develop an internal reinforcement plan. Nothing more. At least that's what the contract stated. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, dust, and something harder to identify, a cold, almost metallic odor like wet stone in catacombs. The main corridor branched off in 3 different directions. Daniel chose the most illuminated route, turning on the tablet where he had already loaded the original building plans. But he soon realized that the maps didn't exactly match what he saw. A door indicated in the plans didn't exist. A real staircase didn't appear in the records. He frowned, annoyed. Flawed historical records, nothing more than that. Outside, the wind blew. Inside, however, there was no draft. Still, something stirred the dust on the ground, leaving a faint trail, as if someone had just walked by. Daniel ignored it. He continued measuring walls, recording slopes, photographing beams. He worked in silence, except for the occasional sound of his own footsteps echoing. Although sometimes the echo seemed to respond with a delay, as if someone else were walking behind him. On the 2nd floor, he found the room with the blank windows. All closed. No view, no apparent function. In the center, a simple wooden chair, facing a blank wall. On the backrest, there were deeply pressed finger marks, as if someone had spent years sitting there, gripping the wood. Daniel photographed. He documented. He catalogued. Rationality above all else. But when he put the tablet away, he realized the chair was no longer centered. It was slightly off, turned a few centimeters to the left. He took a deep breath. Probably structural vibration, old wood, uneven floor. He noted down another technical observation, although his fingers were slightly cold. Late in the afternoon, he found the last piece he needed for his initial report. A small, almost hidden door leading to a narrow staircase. At the top, there was another door, tiny, installed almost 2 meters from the ground. It led nowhere, just a direct exit to the void. He approached. He touched the doorknob. It was icy cold, much colder than the surrounding environment. The instant he turned the metal, he heard a dry, feminine whisper behind him, so close it sent shivers down his spine. "Don't stop." Daniel turned around quickly. Empty hallway, no open windows. No one, just the silence of the mansion breathing slowly all around. He stood still for a few seconds. Then, with effort, he took the last photo and ended his workday. I still didn't believe in curses. I still believed that everything had a technical explanation. But as he walked down the winding hallway, he had the distinct impression that the house was watching his every step, as if it had waited many years for his arrival. And now, I didn't intend to let him go so easily. Daniel returned to the mansion the following morning, before it opened to the public. The sky was grey, and a low-lying mist enveloped the gardens, partially obscuring the stone angel sculptures, weathered by time. Some seemed to weep, not by design, but from the continuous erosion caused by rainwater. The employee who handed him the keys was called Margaret Collins, the property's operations manager. He was just over 50 years old, his hair tied back in a stiff bun, and his eyes were far too attentive for someone who claimed to have worked there for only 2 years. He spoke softly, as if afraid of waking something that was asleep. "Avoid working after sunset," he said, handing her the heavy bunch of keys. "The old lighting flickers, and the motion sensors don't always work properly." Daniel nodded, interpreting it as poor electrical maintenance, nothing more. Margaret did not explain why she avoided looking directly at the windows of the main facade. Inside, Daniel deepened his mapping. He discovered that parts of the house had been rebuilt multiple times. Some walls had layers of wood upon wood, concealing old, sealed doors. In one hallway, he found a section where the floor creaked differently. Below was a hollow space. It wasn't in the records. The Winchester Mystery House has always been surrounded by legends. Sarah Winchester, heiress to the Winchester Arms fortune, supposedly built the house incessantly to appease the spirits of people killed by the family's rifles. That was the official story, touristy, folklore. But Daniel perceived something more practical. No building of that magnitude could remain structurally stable without a minimum of logic. And yet, it had remained standing for over a century, despite earthquakes, haphazard renovations, and the absence of a master plan. That sparked his professional curiosity. At the end of the morning, he met Ethan Morales, electrical maintenance technician. Young, tattoos on his arms, tired eyes. Unlike Margaret, he spoke openly. "I've seen doors close on their own," he said without dramatizing. "And sensors activate in empty hallways, but the worst is the sound of hammers at night, as if someone were still building." Daniel smiled, finding it funny. "Old house, wood expands, metal contracts," he replied. Ethan didn't smile back. "I hope that's all, engineer." While exploring the 3rd floor, Daniel found a room unlike any other. Small, undecorated, dust-free, impeccably clean. In the center, an old notebook rested on a simple table. The yellowed pages contained scribbles in archaic English. One phrase was repeated dozens of times. "If I stop, they come. If I stop, they'll come." Daniel photographed it and kept the notebook in a plastic folder for preservation. It was a historical find. It could be very valuable for academic research. When he left the room, he noticed that the door behind him was no longer where it should be. It was a few centimeters forward, as if the door frame had been moved. He measured, he checked, he recorded. Everything seemed real, everything seemed impossible. That night at his hotel, Daniel reviewed the photos. One of them caught his eye, the image of the hallway where he had found the notebook. In the background, behind him, reflected in an old mirror, was a female silhouette dressed in early 20th century clothing. He didn't remember seeing anyone there. The digital clock on the table showed 2:17 a.m. when Daniel decided that he would return to that room the next day, just to confirm, just to prove that everything had a logical explanation. The mansion, however, had already decided otherwise. Daniel arrived before dawn. The parking lot was empty, and the mansion appeared in the twilight as a crooked silhouette against the lilac sky. The air was colder than the day before. As he unlocked the gate, he noticed that the iron seemed damp, as if it had been washed during the night, although it hadn't rained. He went straight to the 3rd floor. He climbed the stairs, which creaked beneath his feet, counting each step. 23. The day before, there had been 22. He stopped. He got off. He got back on. 23. Daniel took notes. It didn't make sense. Steps don't appear out of nowhere. Wood doesn't grow overnight. It contradicted all the structural laws I knew. In the hallway outside the notebook room, the silence seemed thicker. Opening the door, he found the room empty. The desk was there. The notebook was gone. Daniel searched every corner. Nothing. No speckled dust. No signs of removal. As if the object had never existed. He took a deep breath. Frustration overcame fear. He pulled out his tablet and began scanning the environment with the portable three-dimensional sensor. The walls returned strange readings, hollow spaces where there shouldn't be anything, internal passages that didn't appear on any floor plan. As he touched one of the walls, he heard a dry sound behind it. 3 knocks, pause, 2 more. Daniel slowly backed away. The sound stopped. In the hallway, a light flickered, then another. The electrical system fluctuated until everything was plunged into the red twilight of the emergency lights. Daniel walked back to the stairs. When he reached the middle landing, he heard footsteps above him, slow footsteps, heavy footsteps, going down. He called out, "Ethan!" No response. The footsteps continued, now at the same pace as his. As if someone invisible were descending beside him, step by step. Daniel quickened his pace. His steps did too. He reached the ground floor, opened the main door, and stepped out into the garden, breathing in the cool morning air as if emerging from underwater. Only then did he realize the sun had not yet risen. The watch on his wrist read 8:40. But the sky remained as dark as it was at 5 in the morning. Time seemed to be running out, or the advanced house. In the administrative office, Margaret awaited him, as if she knew he would appear at that very moment. "You found the room, didn't you?" he asked without preamble. Daniel hesitated, then he nodded. Margaret opened a drawer and took out an old photograph. It was black and white. In it, an elderly woman sat in a simple chair, looking at a blank wall. Exactly the chair that Daniel had found on the first day. "Sarah Winchester," Margaret said. "She sat there every night. They say she talked to the dead." Daniel looked at the photo. In the background, out of focus, was a small door high on the wall. The same door to emptiness. "The Foundation doesn't just want to restore the house," Margaret said. "It wants to prove that it's unsafe. If you conclude that in your report, the property will be closed. Forever." Daniel understood at that moment that he had not been hired merely as an engineer. He was the final piece in a decision that was already underway. And somewhere between winding corridors and staircases that shifted location, the house seemed to know it. That night, in his hotel, Daniel tried to sleep. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard distant hammers, building something, somewhere that didn't exist on the map. Daniel spent the next day reviewing structural data in his hotel room. The 3-dimensional models generated by the scanners didn't add up. Internal corridors appeared where there wasn't enough physical space. Stairs intersected at impossible angles. In theory, parts of the house occupied the same space simultaneously. Any other engineer would have concluded it was a reading error, but Daniel knew the sensors were accurate. The impossible was recorded in numbers. He decided to return to the mansion at night. The contract didn't prohibit it. It only recommended avoiding the area after sunset. I would recommend it. At 9:17 p.m., Daniel unlocked the side door. The interior lights were off. Only the moonlight filtered through some stained glass windows, painting the floor with bluish and reddish patches. In the main hall, he found Ethan. The coach was sitting on the floor, leaning against a column, drinking cold coffee from a disposable cup. "You shouldn't be here," Ethan said. "Neither do you," Daniel replied. Ethan smiled tiredly. "I need to keep the generators running. If they stop, things start to happen." Daniel didn't ask what things. He headed for the east corridor. He wanted to check a hollow passage detected by the sensors. Along the way, he found something new. A door that hadn't been there before. Dark wood, no doorknob, just a carved symbol. A circle surrounded by small lines like counting marks. Daniel touched it. The wood was warm, alive. The door opened silently by itself. Inside, a narrow corridor led to a small room lit by a single pendant lamp. In the center, dozens of objects: stopped clocks, eyeless dolls, yellowed letters, pieces of twisted metal. And hanging on the wall was a painting of Sarah Winchester. Her eyes had been scraped from the canvas. On the ground, inscriptions scratched into the wood repeated the same phrase: "Keep building, keep building." Daniel photographed everything. When he left, the door was gone, just a smooth wall. Back at the hall, Ethan was no longer there. Daniel called. Echo. No answer. He went up to the second floor. He found Margaret standing in front of the room with the blank windows. "They don't like being watched," she said, without turning her face away. Daniel asked who. Margaret finally looked at him. Her eyes were filled with tears. Those who died without knowing why. She walked away down the hallway and disappeared around a corner of the house. Daniel followed her. The corridor seemed longer than before. Doors appeared in endless sequence. The sound of hammers echoed, now closer, faster, more urgent. He stopped in front of one of the doors. On the other side he heard breathing, weak, elderly. "Sarah?" she whispered without realizing it. Breathing stopped. The light flickered, and everything went dark. When the emergency lights came on, Daniel was alone, in the middle of a corridor that wasn't on any map. No doors, no windows, no visible exit, just a staircase ahead, leading up to nowhere. Daniel started to climb, one step, other, without realizing that the house had finally accepted him within its own logic. And now he was part of the construction. Daniel climbed the stairs, unsure of how long it would take. The air grew colder with each step. The sound of hammers, once distant, now echoed like a heart pounding within the walls. When he reached the top, he found himself in a circular room, unlike any that had ever existed in architectural records. The walls were made of overlapping planks, some recent, others so old they crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. In the center, a table with a lit candle. The flame did not flicker. There was no wind. There was no smell of smoke. Seated at the table was an elderly woman, dressed in black, her hair tied in a stiff bun. Her bony hands held a small carpentry tool. She didn't need to introduce herself. Daniel recognized her face from the photographs. Sarah Winchester. "You took your time," she said, her voice dry but firm. Daniel tried to speak, but his throat was stiff. He looked around. There were no doors. There were no windows. The ladder he had climbed was no longer behind him. "This place isn't on your maps," Sarah continued. "It's not in the records. It doesn't fit into your logic." Daniel managed to recover his voice. "This is a hallucination. Lack of oxygen. Stress." Sarah smiled slightly. "That's what I've been saying for 40 years. She banged the small tool against the table. The sound echoed like a distant hammer. Instantly, images appeared on the walls. Silhouettes of men, women and children, wounded, bleeding, screaming silently, spirits of victims of Winchester rifles. Daniel stepped back, but there wasn't enough room. "They came," Sarah said. "Because I stopped." Daniel understood. The constant construction wasn't madness. It was containment, an architectural prison for consciences that couldn't accept death. "You kept them here," Daniel said, "and now they want to leave." Sarah nodded. "The house is tired. It needs someone new to continue." Daniel felt the ground vibrate beneath his feet. The sound of hammers became deafening. The walls moved slowly, as if breathing. "I can't," he said. "I don't believe it." Sarah stood up. Her presence became diffuse, like smoke on water. "Believing was never necessary," he replied. "Just keep going." The candle went out. Daniel fell to his knees. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the main hallway on the first floor. The sun streamed in through the windows. The clock showed 9 a.m., as if nothing had happened, but in her hand was an object. The small carpentry tool that Sarah was holding, cold, heavy, real. That night, in his hotel, Daniel realized his fingers were moving on their own across the table, tapping rhythmically like an invisible hammer, and he understood with silent terror that the tipping point had already occurred. The house no longer needed Sarah Winchester. Now they had Daniel Harper. Daniel tried to ignore what had happened. He spent the entire day analyzing reports, repeating to himself that it was all just exhaustion. However, whenever he stopped typing, his fingers would tap on the table by themselves. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, like a code. The following morning, he returned to the mansion to complete the final report. It was the last day of his contract. If he delivered a report indicating a serious structural risk, the foundation would close the house. If he didn't deliver, he would lose the payment and his reputation. Margaret was waiting for him at the entrance, her eyes immediately fixed on his hands. "You came into the room," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel did not answer. Margaret opened the front door without using the keys. The wood unlocked itself. Inside, the atmosphere was different. More hallways, more doors, more stairs. As if the house had grown overnight. Ethan appeared in a hurry. "The power went out at 3 in the morning," he said. "All the sensors went off at the same time. Then silence, as if something had been completed." Daniel walked to the center of the hall. He felt each plank beneath his feet, as if they were extensions of his own body. He knew the structure. He knew where each beam should be. And yet, the house seemed to rearrange itself under his presence. Margaret spoke softly. "She chose you." Daniel closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw for a moment the silhouettes on the walls. Empty faces, outstretched hands, waiting. He took a deep breath and walked to the room with the blank windows. The chair was in the center, exactly as in the old photograph. Exactly as on the first day. Without realizing it, Daniel sat down. The banging began, coming from all directions, like thousands of hammers building at the same time. But nobody was there. Daniel opened the tablet and began writing the report. His fingers were typing on their own. Stable structure, no significant risks, maintenance recommended. Building can remain open to the public. Margaret watched without saying anything. When Daniel finished, the sound of the hammers ceased. The walls stopped vibrating. Silence returned. He stood up slowly, without remembering having decided to do so. The carpentry tool had disappeared from his pocket. Margaret handed him the coat. "Thank you for continuing," she said. Daniel left the mansion without looking back. The sky was clear, the wind was gentle, the world seemed normal. But as he got into the car, his fingers began tapping on the steering wheel, rhythmically, constantly. 3, pause. 2, somewhere inside the Winchester mystery house, a new door had just been built. Daniel tried to resume his life in San Jose. He accepted new projects, attended meetings, and submitted proposals. To everyone around him, he remained the same methodical and reliable engineer, but inside him, something remained under continuous construction. At night, his fingers would tap on the table, on the steering wheel, on the headboard, hammering rhythms that never ceased. He started wearing gloves to sleep, carefully tying his hands to prevent them from moving on their own. Even so, he would wake up with aching palms, as if he had worked all night. The first challenge arose a week later. During a meeting with investors for a new project, Daniel suddenly realized that the building's floor plan in front of him did not match what was being presented. Corridors changed position before his eyes. Stairs appeared where they hadn't existed. Doors led to blank walls. He blinked. Everything went back to normal, but the feeling remained. He now saw spaces differently, as if the logic of the house had contaminated his perception of the world. That night, Daniel drove unconsciously toward Saratoga Road. He only realized it when he parked in front of the gates of the Winchester Mystery House. The place was closed, dark, silent. Even so, the side door opened by itself. Daniel entered. The house welcomed him back like a body recognizes an organ returning to its proper place. He walked through the corridors with ease. He no longer needed maps. He knew where every passage was, even those that hadn't existed before. He climbed stairs, turned corners, and passed through doors that appeared before him. He arrived at the circular room. The candle was lit again. Sarah Winchester wasn't there, but the chair in front of the table remained empty. Waiting, Daniel sat down. The beats began. Soft at first, then faster, more numerous. Daniel took a deep breath and closed his eyes. This time, he couldn't resist. He moved his hands in the air as if holding invisible tools. With each gesture, he felt the house react. Wood fitting together, nails piercing planks, new spaces being born. He was not being possessed, he was learning. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his apartment, sitting at the dining table. There was fresh sawdust on the wood. Daniel smiled for the first time since it all began. The house was not cursed, it was a responsibility, and he finally understood how to continue. In the following weeks, subtle changes began to be noticed in the mansion. Employees commented on new doors appearing in old hallways. Small staircases emerged where there had previously been smooth walls. No construction crew had been hired. No building materials had been delivered. Even so, the house kept growing. Margaret silently recorded everything, like a guardian of an ancient ritual. Ethan, however, couldn't hide his fear. One morning, he found an eyeless doll sitting in front of the electrical panel, holding a small toy hammer. Since then, he quit his job. He never went back. The foundation responsible for the property announced a final inspection. A safety committee would arrive within 3 days to decide whether the mansion would remain open to the public. Daniel received the email at work. He read it. He smiled. That night he returned home. The gate opened before he touched it. The inner corridors were silent. No tourists, no guides, no human voices. Only the soft sound of wood settling, like bones adjusting. Daniel walked to the room with the blank windows. There, he found Margaret waiting. "They're coming to lock up the house," she said. "You know what happens if they lock it up." Daniel nodded. Without continuous construction, the consciousnesses trapped there would seek a way out, not just in the mansion, anywhere, in any vulnerable mind. "Then we need to convince them," said Daniel. Margaret opened an old cabinet and took out original blueprints of the house, hand-drawn sketches by Sarah Winchester. Among them, a blank space, an unfinished project. "This part was never built," Margaret said. "Sarah died before." Daniel observed the drawings. A central structure, a room larger than all the others, a point of convergence. "If we complete this," Daniel said, "the house will become stable, permanent. It won't need to grow anymore." Margaret closed her eyes. "Or it will release everything at once." Daniel took a deep breath. "So we have 3 days." That morning, residents near the property heard hammers echoing incessantly. They didn't come from any specific place, but they filled the air like metallic rain. On the 3rd day, the committee arrived, 3 inspectors, clipboards, flashlights, skepticism. Daniel greeted them at the main entrance, which now featured a new staircase that hadn't existed the previous week. "Welcome to Winchester Mystery House," he said. "I'd like to show you the new wing." And for the first time, the house paved the way not only for Daniel, but for everyone who was about to decide their fate. The inspectors followed Daniel through the interior of the mansion. Flashlights cut through the dim light, revealing newly built corridors, still light wood, smelling of fresh resin. They took notes, intrigued, but maintaining a professional tone. "There is no record of these wings," commented the chief inspector, Dr. Helen Carter. "We recently updated the floor plan," Daniel replied calmly. "Internal structural renovations." Helen raised an eyebrow, but she continued. Margaret followed the group in silence. Her eyes never left Daniel. The tour continued until they reached the new central staircase, Sarah's unfinished project. It spiraled upwards, leading to a tall door, carved with the same circular symbol that Daniel had seen on the door that had disappeared weeks before. Helen tried to open the door. He couldn't. Daniel approached. His fingers touched the wood. He felt the pulse of the house beneath the palm of his hand. The door opened by itself. Everyone went inside. The room was immense, round. The ceiling so high that the flashlight barely reached it. On the walls, thousands of names carved into the wood. Men, women, children, ancient dates, recent dates, some still fresh in our minds. The air grew heavy. One of the inspectors stepped back. "What is this?" Helen asked, trying to remain composed. The lights flickered. The sound of hammers began, weak, then loud, then deafening. The walls were shaking. The floor was vibrating. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered, "They are here." Shadows appeared all around, human silhouettes, some faceless, others with open wounds, spirits that never found rest. The inspectors shouted. They tried to run, but the doors had disappeared. There was no way out. Helen looked at Daniel. "Stop it!" Daniel took a deep breath. He walked to the center of the room. The shadows approached, hands outstretched, begging for liberation, begging for justice. Then he saw, among the silhouettes, an elderly woman, small, dressed in black, Sarah Winchester. She didn't speak. He simply handed him the carpentry tool silently. Daniel understood. If I kept building, I'd keep them all trapped there forever. If it stopped, they would be freed into the world. Helen fell to her knees, covering her face. Margaret wept silently. Daniel looked around. He saw the names on the walls, the victims, the consequences of a legacy of violence that had never been confronted. He picked up the tool, and he dropped it on the floor. The sound echoed like thunder. Instantly, the hammering ceased. The walls stopped shaking. The shadows began to dissipate into particles of light, like dust in the wind. Sarah smiled at Daniel, and it disappeared. The room lit up. The doors reappeared. The inspectors rushed out in panic. Daniel remained standing in the center, watching the last traces of the silhouettes disappear. The house, for the first time in over a century, was in absolute silence. The curse was over, but Daniel Harper had changed forever. He was no longer just an engineer. He was the man who freed the dead. The morning sun illuminated the gardens of the Winchester mansion as never before. The sky was clear. The air was light. There was no cold wind, nor strange shadows on the windows. The house remained standing, but something fundamental had changed inside. The inspection committee left the site without saying a word. No report was finalized that day. No official decision was made. Just silence. The kind of silence that follows events that don't fit into bureaucratic forms. Margaret remained on the entrance steps, watching Daniel. "They're gone," she said. Daniel nodded. His eyes were tired but serene. "The house doesn't need to grow any bigger." Margaret breathed deeply, as if she had been carrying a weight for years without realizing it. Without the spirits, without the obligation of continuous construction, she now seemed like just an ordinary employee, a free woman. Ethan returned that afternoon to retrieve his tools from the shed. Upon seeing Daniel, he simply nodded with silent respect. He asked no questions. Some answers need not be heard. In the following days, experts sent by the Foundation inspected the structure. They found no new corridors, no extra doors, no impossible readings on the sensors. The mansion was finally stable, like any old historical building. The final report stated, "Structurally sound building, exceptional historical value, preservation recommended." Daniel did not sign the document. He simply handed it over to the Foundation and requested to be removed from the project. A few weeks later, tourists returned to visit the Winchester Mystery House. Guides recounted the old stories of Sarah Winchester's curse. Children laughed at the confusing hallways. Adults took pictures of the doors leading nowhere. Nobody knew that the stairs weren't changing anymore. The doors didn't disappear. The hammers had fallen silent. In his apartment, Daniel watched his own hands. They remained motionless. For the first time in months, they weren't tapping on their own. He opened a drawer and took out the small carpentry tool. It was broken in half. Daniel smiled, relieved. A few nights later, he slept without dreams, without hammers, without endless corridors. And somewhere in California, the Winchester Mystery House remained quiet, no longer a prison for spirits, but simply a strange house, a silent witness to a past finally closed. 3 months later, a child got lost during a guided tour of the mansion. She was found minutes later, standing in front of a smooth wall on the second floor. She was staring blankly into space, as if observing something invisible. The guide approached. "Is everything all right, dear?" The girl smiled. The lady in black said, "I can leave now." The guide felt a sudden chill, but in the blink of an eye, the child was already running back to her parents. That night, the security guard made his final rounds. As he passed the room with the blank windows, he heard something he hadn't heard in years. A single beat, suave, like a distant hammer. Some houses hold stories, others keep their desires to themselves. The Winchester Mystery House remains open to visitors. Its winding corridors, doors leading nowhere, and staircases that don't actually lead anywhere still elicit curious laughter and casual photos. For most, it's simply the eccentric construction of an eccentric heiress, but if you ever walk through its corridors, if you hear a soft tapping sound when no one is around, if you feel like a wall is watching you back, perhaps you remember this story. And perhaps you'll understand that certain legends don't spring from nothing. They survive because something in them remains true, even when no one else believes them. Now we want to hear from you. Would you dare to spend an entire night in the Winchester Mystery House? He believes that Daniel truly freed all the spirits. Or did it simply make room for something new to occupy the house? Share your opinion. Tell us in the comments what you would do if faced with a door that leads to emptiness. And if you enjoyed this macabre journey, don't forget to follow our next stories, because some houses never stop calling, and maybe the next door will open for you.